I served 20 years in prison for something I didn't do. But I lost my freedom, my best friend, my daughter, my job, hell, everything I ever loved.
You still watching that thing? Look, it's just not healthy. You and Joanna were magic together.
What's that?
Our anniversary present.
Our?
What, to make videos.
She's gone. And I know she wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone.
I want them to find the monster that did this to Joanna. And these people don't care. Nobody cares.
Then why don't you do something about it?
I'm Brian McQuery, the writer, producer, director, and executive producer of PLEA, and here's my answers to Tinsel and Time's 5 questions for indie filmmakers. Number 1, in a nutshell, what was the main inspiration for your film and or the theme that is the heart of your film? I'm the proud son of a Chicago police officer, and I'm wearing my dad's Chicago police watch. And in 2016, I was almost killed in a violent crime in Los Angeles. And I kind of took those things and distilled them into a narrative that doesn't have any of the details of my case, but that takes the trauma and advocacy of that situation and puts it into a film. I was not expected to make it. I was put in a paralytic coma, on ECMO, and on a ventilator for a week. I woke up with my jaw wired shut. I had questions. I tried to write in a notebook. My coordination was off, so I was just writing chicken scratch. So initially I had no way to communicate. Then later I had to learn to walk again. Learned that while once I came out of the coma, I identified the person who did it. The police knew who he was and was charged with a misdemeanor. That wasn't good enough for my mom and I, so we advocated with the DA's office, got him charged with a felony, got a felony arrest warrant, but then the LAPD said they didn't have the resources to go after him, so we had to advocate there, and eventually they did arrest him, and he's now a convicted felon, which is just. So I took all of that trauma I went through, that advocacy, which is very frustrating, and channeled that into PLEA. Number 2, tell us a bit about the music. Who did you work with? What did you want to convey? So PLEA is interesting because we have 2 composers. There is a true crime documentary aspect to PLEA that exists within our film, and it's something that the main character, Tom Healy, obsessively watches. It's about his wife's case. She was raped and murdered. It's about his best friend who was convicted of the crime and spends 20 years in prison trying to prove his innocence. So we had one composer for the documentary and then one composer for the actual narrative. And the narrative composer was Patrick Donahoe. He's a friend of mine. He has a cool band called Kamove, and he wants to do more film music. So I worked with him to craft several themes that I wanted to recur and at times mash up. One was for our kidnapping plot. I wanted something very tense, something that made you uncomfortable. And while all of it is of the same piece, Pat did different riffs and variations on each of the kidnapping scenes. For Joanna, I wanted a very haunting and emotional theme, and Pat really nailed that one. And I love the way it recurs, and I love the way it makes you feel when you hear it. And then for Tom Healy, the main character, who's a recluse, he's obsessively watching this documentary. He's calling and advocating for his wife and trying to find the real killer. Wanted something just very depressing. So those were the 3 main themes that Pat worked with. Then I worked with Barry J. Neely on the documentary side. Previously worked with Barry on my short films Intruder and Confession. And I wanted something very positive for Hardy, the man who was wrongfully convicted and is trying to find a way out of prison and to prove his innocence. And Barry created a piece of music called Letters, which every time I see the film, which is a lot when you make a film, different edits, different variations, different outputs, you're approving everything. And every time I hear Letters, it sticks with me for a few days in a very positive way. It's my favorite piece of music in the film. Barry also created a theme for the real killer, and I wanted something creepy and something that gets under your skin. And Barry delivered on that as well. And he also created more music for the documentary dealing with Hardy being convicted and like a darker theme there. So number 3, was there a point where you almost didn't finish your film? And if so, what pushed you forward? Well, this was an independent film. We had only a certain amount of money to work with. And initially you're budgeting and you're estimating numbers and you're projecting. And as the actual numbers started coming in and being slotted into the budget, it was starting to get beyond our means, especially with the COVID protocols, which are very serious and should be. They're very important, but they just cost a lot more than I was projecting them to be. And we were right on the precipice, and it looked like we didn't have the means to make the film because we wanted to make sure we didn't just have enough to shoot it. We wanted to have enough to get through post and actually have a finished film to submit to film festivals. So I talked to a friend, John Brosnan. He asked to read the screenplay, and his 401k films came through with the chunk of money that we needed to ensure we could make and complete the film. John also came out on set, and he served the role as our DIT, and he wore other hats and jumped in wherever he needed to, often with art department. And John is really the MVP of our film, because there'd be no film to talk about, no film to screen at film festivals without John. We probably would have just had to abandon the project. Number 4, give a shout out to your creative team and anyone who helped get your film from an idea to the FirstGlance Film Festival in Philadelphia. So I reached out to a cinematographer friend of mine, Kenneth Young. He's an old friend. I'd worked with him on a couple of projects, and he's a poker buddy too. And because of our low budget and because of his work obligations, he also brought on someone else, David Ethan Sanders, and they often work together. So we had a team, and we prepped the movie together. We location scouted together. Ken shot the 2/3 of the film, and then he had another work obligation. And David stepped in, and he shot 1/3 of the film. And there's 3 different storylines. There's a kidnapping story, there's the documentary, and there's the Tom Home Alone story. So it really worked out because David shot one storyline while Ken shot the other 2. And the whole process was seamless just because we all communicated and shared the same vision and executed. Another collaborator was Jarrett Reichel. He's the editor of PLEA. And we worked almost entirely remotely because of COVID, because of our different work obligations and schedules. And so I provided tons and tons of notes for him, takes that I liked and how I wanted things cut, and just all manner of notes that I could provide him with so that when he worked on PLEA, he knew what I was looking for. And then once we had a solid cut, we did get together and we had a fine-tuning session, but that was only about 90 minutes. We did another session to do the credits and make sure those were right. But it was really a smooth experience working remotely, and we just communicated really well. And each time there was a cut or a sequence to look at, I would give him notes. It was a very smooth experience. Number 5, name 5 favorite films which influenced your desire to be a filmmaker. It's always tough to pick 5, but I'm going to focus on the explosion of independent cinema in the 1990s. I lived in Chicago, well, in the Chicago suburbs at that time, but born and raised in Chicago. And Chicago has a great art house scene, so I got to see all these films theatrically, because you see just about anything in Chicago. I also was an early adopter of the Laserdisc, and films would come out letterboxed in widescreen and with commentaries and extras. So I watched these films I'm going to name many times. I listened to their commentaries, I watched their extras, and actually I eventually got to meet all of these filmmakers, at least briefly. So the first one is from 1992, El Mariachi, made by Robert Rodriguez, which is the true definition of DIY. He also wrote a book, Rebel Without a Crew, that is a must-read for filmmakers that I've read multiple times. I got to meet him at Grindhouse Night at New Beverly Cinema, where they showed Grindhouse trailers, the movie Grindhouse, and then Machete. I brought Michael Biehn to the theater that night, and I got to talk to Robert in the lobby briefly about Michael's film, The Victim, which I worked on. And Robert was very approachable and cool. Also in 1992, Reservoir Dogs by Quentin Tarantino. That was a big influence on me, big influence on my writing. And Quentin was working at a slightly higher level than some of these other films I'm naming, because he had a great ensemble cast of established character actors and had a higher budget level, but it was still an astonishing debut and terrific movie. And I met him twice at New Beverly Cinema. Once on Grindhouse Night, I met him at the concession stand, and he talked about how much the audience loved Michael Biehn, who I brought that night. And then I met him once when he was there with Christoph Waltz to watch a film. 1994, Clerks. This was a big one for me. Kevin Smith, huge Kevin Smith fan. Saw him many times in public at Comic-Con and at some of his Evening with Kevin Smith events. But in 1995, I went to San Diego Comic-Con for the very first time. I got a ticket to an advanced screening of his second movie, Mallrats. And as I was leaving the theater, Kevin was standing in the back. And I walked out to the lobby, and I thought, that was Kevin Smith in the back. And so I built up the nerve, and I went back into theater to talk to him. It was just he and I. We talked for a good 5 minutes. He was very encouraging. And he said, stop talking about being a filmmaker and be a filmmaker. Me and my friends can do it. Anyone can. And that really motivated me. I went back to Chicago. I had a screenplay that I liked, and I cast it with local actors, and I started shooting the rehearsals in locations the way I wanted to shoot the movie. It was shooting on video, and I assembled the whole rehearsal thing into the movie, and it just ultimately didn't feel like it was strong enough to really put all the resources into it, and I really didn't know what I was doing yet. And so that got abandoned. But Kevin really lit the fuse for me. And frankly, he's the one to blame for me choosing this path. In 1995, The Brothers McMullen by Edward Burns. And that was another one that really influenced me and was, truly an independent film. I got to see him at 2 Q&A screenings in Hollywood, hosted by Jeff Goldsmith, one for Newlyweds and one for Fitzgerald Family Christmas. And in one of those Q&As, he talked about Sidney Lumet. And so afterwards, I got to meet him, and I got to tell him the story that Charles Dutton told me about Sidney Lumet when I worked with Charles on a film. And Ed enjoyed the story. He was very down-to-earth and friendly, cool guy. And then the last of my 5 is from 1996, Swingers, written and starring Jon Favreau, directed by Doug Liman. I went with my mom to the Aero Theater a few years ago for a Gene Wilder tribute of Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. And Mel Brooks was there in person to introduce the film. And I remember at one point, Mel said he had to pause for a second because he had to pull his pants up. It was very Mel Brooks. But just by chance, we sat behind Jon Favreau and Faison Love. So in between the films, I got a chance to talk to John. I asked him if I could ask him some questions, and he was very open to it. Very accessible. I asked him some things about Jungle Book, actually, which I was really impressed by. But John, of course, has an amazing filmography, and he was just another friendly guy, down to earth, very approachable. I have to quickly give a shout out to 5 more 90s films that influenced me, just because it's hard to pick 5. I'll just name them. After Dark, My Sweet by James Foley, Laws of Gravity by Nick Gomez, One False Move by Carl Franklin, What Happened Was by Tom Noonan, and In the Company of Men by Neil LaBute. I hope that you will check out the trailer for PLEA, which you can find on YouTube. Go to the Facebook page for PLEA Film. Follow us. See where it's screening at different film festivals. It's going to be at FirstGlance Philadelphia in October. And if you're in Philly, I'd love you to come out and see the film. Thank you for watching.